evening and welcome to the Womxn Show. I'm Lenina Rassool. This month we celebrated International Women's Day under the theme #ChooseToChallenge. Now the United Nations Women launched the day with a separate sub-theme called Women in Leadership, Achieving Equality in a COVID-19 World. Now here on the Womxn Show we've spoken significantly about gender inequality, about the gender pay gap where women get paid less for the same job than men do. And we've also spoken about the gap in leadership positions. But tonight we're going to be speaking about women at work and women in leadership with a twist. We are going to be giving some attention to a space that is not often spoken about but deserves as much attention. And I'm talking about the space inside ourselves with regard to leadership. A space inside ourselves where we struggle with identity, with capability, and a sense of self-worth. This space is often referred to as the Imposter Syndrome. Now joining us later is Nomfundo Mogape, who is the Executive Director of the Center for the Study of Reconciliation and Violence. She is a clinical psychologist and also the founder of the Mental Wellness Initiative. And we're going to unpack imposter syndrome. We're going to say, what does it look like when we feel like we don't deserve the positions that we have, when we feel like we're perhaps a fraud, and the fear of being found out and possibly having our whole lives fall apart. But before that, we are going to hear from some women leaders who do struggle with imposter syndrome, because believe me, so many women do. Let's hear what they have to say. Welcome back. You're still watching The Womxn Show, and tonight we're speaking about women at work, women in leadership, and the spaces inside ourselves that make us doubt our capabilities and our abilities as female leaders. Now, I'm going to start by saying I read a book recently called The Art of Gathering by Priya Parker, and in this book, she speaks about the barrier to a successful gathering being the who am I to complex. Now, even though this book was about events, it really spoke to me because one of the spaces inside ourselves that often is just niggling away is the question, who am I to make big decisions? Who am I to be an entrepreneur? Who am I to be a business owner or a CEO or a director or an executive? And I bring this up because I have these conversations with other women and men all of the time. Now, joining me now is Nomfundo Mogape, who is the Executive Director of the Center for the Study of Reconciliation and Violence. She is a clinical psychologist, and she's also the founder of the Mental Wellness Initiative. And together we're going to unpack the notion of imposter syndrome and why we feel like we don't belong in those positions. Nomfundo, thank you for joining us.
Hi, Lenina. Thank you for having me here again.
Yes, so Nomfundo, I'm very excited for today's conversation. We are speaking about what is commonly known as imposter syndrome. And, I have lots of conversations, I mean, almost every conversation with someone in the context of work, and our skill set and how we feel at work has elements of imposter syndrome in there, also in entrepreneurship, also with business leaders. And I think a lot of the literature and how most people understand it is as a sense of not belonging, where they are, as a sense of feeling. And I think the popular term is feeling like a fraud, and also that somebody is going to jump out one day and just discover that you don't know how to do your job and everything's going to fall apart.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to just start with, from your perspective, just definitions of what is imposter syndrome really. How is it characterized by the ways that we feel? And just some basic explanations from your perspective.
Yeah. So I think it's exactly what you have said, is this sense, and actually the difficulty with being able to occupy our space in the world, occupying our space non-apologetically, being able to say, this is me. Because what happens is that when we grow up, especially in contexts that are not able to affirm us, validate us, and reflect back to us just our worth and our okayness, what then happens is that we just wear this mask that we hide behind, because we have this sense that I'm either not good enough at what I'm doing, or I'm not lovable enough. I have to be in a certain way to be enough. So we wear this mask, and by the time we are adult, for some of us, it almost becomes like who we are. And then when we get opportunities and we are put in spaces where we are supposed to just occupy them and show our light, really, it becomes very difficult for us to do that. We feel like, yes, as you were saying, like we are a fraud, like we don't belong here. This sense that actually people are gonna see after some time that I'm not real. I'm not as worthy. I'm not as capable. I'm not as able as they think I am. And most of the time, Lenina, this is not even as much about our perception of other people, but it is about these negative perceptions about ourselves that we've sort of internalized and have become our truth. So that is really what that is about. And when you've grown up in a context where I think like in South Africa, it is not just only in relation to the family and the people around you that are close who are able to do that, but it's also growing up in a society, I call it a wounded society, that was not designed to celebrate us, to see us, to acknowledge us. It becomes even much more difficult to be able to occupy your space as you and know that I am okay as I am. I mustn't be limited by all the standards that the world has put around me.
No, and it's very interesting that you say that, Nomfundo, because when you said it's not our perception of others, it's sort of our perception of ourselves. I think the interesting thing about imposter syndrome is that it's illogical. So you could have 10 degrees, we find CEOs, we have, I mean, even with myself, sometimes I go back and I read my CV to remind myself that I have done these things, that I am capable, that I am a writer. And so when you speak about this wounded society and you speak about the history of apartheid, we have to acknowledge that people were deemed incapable of doing things just because, innately incapable for some sort of external thing that has got nothing to do with their capabilities. And so
Yeah.
when you say, I'm guessing from your perspective, how does that manifest in imposter syndrome? Do you think that there are still
Yeah.
sort of offshoots, especially when we're speaking about intersectional now, especially with people of color?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's really an important point, because the imposter syndrome is a global phenomena. Women Next also experience it. People who are not confined within your stereotypical, gender notions. Also, people who don't follow the mainstream culture also experience it generally in the world, right? Because you are in a society that doesn't confirm that you are okay as you are.
Mm.
But in South Africa, it gets even more complicated, right? So you come in, you are, as you say, you come, you are a person of color, you might be a woman, you might be somebody who's not gender confirming. All of these things come together, and then there's the racial component, of course, that we grow up in a society. And when I talk to people about this, like in terms of the role of both patriarchy and colonialism, is that these are notions that have been created for not even years, right? It's for centuries. They have become, it has become common for us to hear all this negativity about who we are and our own sense of self-image. We grew up in it, it is acceptable. And when we dare to show up, I know like in our culture, we are papa, how dare you show up
Yes.
and think you matter? How dare you show up and think that you can be like this? So for us, really, imposter syndrome in the context of South Africa means that dealing with it is actually dealing with centuries of learning that actually confirms that you are not worthy, you don't belong here, you are not capable. And it therefore requires for us to dig deep down. I mean, last time when we were talking about depression, I was saying that a lot of people are increasingly saying it is difficult to work in South Africa. It is really, not only is it difficult, some people say it's just really, really painful. Because for us, even the institutions, the institutions in our country were created to make us feel that because of how you look and because of the color of your skin and because of your gender and your gender identification, you are not enough. So all these things make the imposter syndrome in South Africa to be even much more pronounced because everything that and the studies is showing now that actually, trauma changes your genetic makeup. Now it's also being transferred to
Yeah.
us from our mothers, from our fathers, and then our clans confirm this. So it has become this prison that completely stops us. And the thing, Lenina, that then happens when the imposter syndrome is so strong, and this is what I have been seeing, and I've just been saying, I am so concerned with what is happening to the the black middle class, black,
Mm.
including all groups, because I am seeing people who push themselves. There is high level of stress. They are sick. We're living on pills. Because what's happening then is that we have this sense that I have to push, I have to prove myself. We get into the workplace and we work from the space of proving ourselves. We
Mhm.
don't have a work balance. We don't take care of ourselves. I mean, I've worked with people in my own organization, managers who actually feel guilty. They feel guilty for taking time off
Yeah.
because there's this sense that you don't deserve to be here. And also, I mean, maybe whilst BEE has been good, there's this sense and transformation, but there's this sense that, oh, you are unique. We actually giving you a favor to
Yeah.
actually be here. So you must prove yourself. So over and above this imposter syndrome, there's this I need to prove myself syndrome. And the other thing that I'm seeing is this, I call it the internalized privilege complex. We know privilege is such a dirty word in South Africa, but I'm seeing more and more of this us in influential position almost feeling guilty when we are stressed. It's like how dare I even become stressed when so many people around me are suffering? I'm so privileged. I've got so much more. I should be okay. So
Mm.
there is so many things that just complicates how this imposter syndrome looks like in our country.
You're raising such like really interesting and important points, and I think, and I even spoke with someone recently um, on that topic of sort of feeling grateful. I had a period where I was, Oprah and a lot of people are speaking about having a gratitude journal and using this gratitude journal towards sort of your mental health. But there's also another side of feeling. I mean, I know for me, um, yes, I am thankful for the opportunities and privileges that I've had. Um, but in the context of grateful, you must be so grateful that you cannot complain, that you cannot,
Yeah.
be entitled to feel anxiety or stress or downplay literally everything that you do, because
Mm.
because I don't know what the expectations are. I think I myself have confusion around expectations. I said to someone yesterday, there are these unrealistic expectations, I think, for people, but especially I think for women, and we're just like sort of flailing around, not knowing, not being able to fit in anywhere. And so,
Yeah, yeah,
yes, and so I wanted to ask you, so within the context of that, and it sounds really, gloomy as you're speaking. I'm like, there's all of this going on, it feels so huge. Like, how do you, I myself, I do a lot of reading, and through that, and internal, sort of questioning internal, beliefs and external structures. But what are some ways that we can sort of, do that? What are some healthy ways to do
yeah,
that?
yeah, yeah. So I mean, just to touch on your reflection, which I really think is powerful, the thing that just was coming to my mind was that the gift has become a burden.
Mm,
That's what happens to us. The very things that we work so hard for, that our gift becomes a burden, like we need to prove them. So I think the first stage, for me, it's really just the stage of awakening, because there's so many people who are not able to rest in their jobs. They are struggling. Our parents struggled for the struggle, but we continue to have these internal struggles. A lot of South Africans are unable to just rest in their jobs and enjoy what they have. But what complicates that is that we are so asleep to what actually informs that. So there's a huge awakening project that needs to happen in our society. For me, when I started doing the work on collective trauma, collective wounding, intergenerational wounding, and of course, understanding my own family wounding and how my mother showed up, and how that impacts how I show up, how my dad showed up in the world, what they said when I showed up. For me, just awakening to that, Lenina, was just such a relief, because I, first of all, just understood where it comes from. I understood why it was so heavy and why it was so intense. And that the struggle I'm fighting is my struggle as Nomfundo, but I am fighting my mother's, my grandmother's, the intergenerational struggle. So just an understanding of indeed the responsibility that is upon our shoulders, and what we are feeling. That awakening, I think it's really important. And then I think once we become awake to it, be able to really cultivate empathy and care for ourselves. Because then the journey of beginning to really face ourselves and heal can be very difficult. I mean, I've seen people where I do some of this work, they really become awake, like, oh, I come from a wounded context. I can see exactly how my mother's drinking, oh, my father's depression. I can see how it has affected me. But then there is then this sort of guilt of like, okay, but where should I even start? This is too much. And I say to people, when you've been awake to it, you are already there in being able to start doing the work. And we talk like in coaching about just having the capacity to notice yourself with love and care and empathy. Notice the patterns where there is. So if you're sitting there and you're feeling like, oh my gosh, the imposter syndrome come, just by noticing it and calling it out for what it is loses power. Because that which you can't name is that which is likely to bring destruction in your life. So facing it, naming it for what it is. I've even come to a point where, I mean, I've done a lot of work to identify, I call it my wounded self and how it shows up. So
mm,
when I stand up in a meeting, I feel it. I'm like, okay, I see you. I acknowledge you. Okay, you are here. Thank you, but I don't need you now.
mm,
And I mean, secondly, understand the defenses. So when it shows up, it is that imposter syndrome, that mask you had put on because it helped you at that time, right? If you had a very harsh father, you just needed to be maybe nice and be sweet. It helped you to survive then, but it doesn't help you now. So just acknowledge that I appreciate this as a defense. I needed to survive, but I'm an adult now. I can do it. So work on understanding your defenses and your patterns on how you show up. And then I always say to people that behind the defense, there's usually a lot of pain that needs to be seen, that needs to be acknowledged. And I really encourage people that try, and if you can, I'm a proponent of really going for counseling. We can talk about that another time. This how counseling has been packaged as a Western thing, and therefore we've rejected it, which is just a lie, because a lot of counseling principles are very much grounded in who we are as a people. But of course, as usual, the West comes and takes things and repackage them as if they belong to them. if you are in an organization where you can do coaching, I would really encourage for you to do coaching. But some of your emotions may not even need a professional. We always say, a problem shared, it's a problem halved. The power of being around a company that is caring, that is supportive, where you can just share and to talk about your struggle, it's really, really important. So if you've got friends that you can share with, we find that journaling also assists anything that helps you, because when you've experienced pain, it needs to be validated, it needs to be acknowledged, and it needs to be held. Once it does that, it loses its power. So you need to have strategies that can be able to help you to do that. Sometimes I know people, I say, you could think some of the things we do in our spaces are crazy, but they help. Sometimes I will literally, so what my counselor will do with my coach, now I do it with myself, right? When I'm really in a difficult space, I put 3 chairs around the table and I'm like, okay. So I sit in as myself, really like experiencing what I'm experiencing and whatever is going on for me. I sit in there as whoever is the person that I'm having a challenge with. And then I sit as an observer, as a caring, empathic, and neutral observer. But it allows me to access different aspects of myself, which then unlocks the wounded self. Because we get caught up in this wounded self and see things from the wounded self. So there is a lot of strategies that people can be able to do to begin to just, be awake to the wound, look at healing the wound, transforming the wound, and then finally transcending and being the best that you can despite the where you come from and the wound that you've experienced.
I love that, Nomfundo, and thank you for sharing that, and even the personal exercise. Because I have to say, with me, it took me a long time to move into doing those exercises because a lot of them sounded and felt so silly.
Yes,
I couldn't
yes.
understand, but I think that's also where we come into sort of notions of playing, and how powerful playing
Yes.
is, and sort of opening up in terms of creativity. And we're seeing a lot of this in the business books, especially I see in these serious Harvard business manuals where they're talking about the notions of opening up and empathy and playing. And I also wanted to add, one thing that really took me a while to get to in terms of interrogating myself and validating was being non-judgmental, was setting aside the judgment. Because if we're honest, the imposter syndrome, it criticizes the self. It is very inward focused. So I remember one of my first TV interviews I had to do via Skype before Zoom time. And they didn't ask me the correct questions, and they didn't have the mechanisms in place. But when it was done, I switched on the light, laid down on the floor and cried. And I just kept, my mother was there. She was so worried because I just said, I just want to die now. I remember the feeling is so intense and so self-critical. And so, I think this also comes from our perception of how we are judged. So I wanted to ask you about, when we look at these different generations in South Africa, one of the things I often speak to with women, in our age, we're in the workforce, we are coming up against this, and we're doing this work on self, but we're butting up against the older generation that is still saying to us, avoid, don't say that, don't do that, don't don't face it. And there's this whole sort of culture and avoidance, and we find it sort of all over, but especially within families, I think. And so and before I ask the question, I just want to say, I always say, we've got these wonderful memes on Facebook. And so they say, you can cut out toxic people, and you should do this, and you should say that, and you should turn your back. And I'm like, nobody tells you how to handle the backlash. If you, if you challenge, what happens is you get rejected. So I wanted to ask you about sort of that space, and if you have anything to contribute in terms of when you are finding yourself, and when you are working through this stuff, and you come up against external judgment, and you come up against external backlash. How can we deal with those situations?
I think very, very important questions. So let's just start talking about the judgment, which I think is just at the core of the culture of our society, right? We are a society that really struggles with being firm, to say I can be firm without being harsh. And we equate those, that for me to be firm, I have to be harsh. And we grow up with parents who feel they have to shout at us and really be harsh, because if they don't, become firm with us, still being gentle, like we'll be spoiled. So the concept, and I would people who are really interested to go and read further, I would really encourage them to read on this concept of the inner critic. I think for me that was my biggest work, Lenina, as a leader, working on this concept of this inner critic. So if we're gonna deal with the judgments, there is the most important judgment that we need to deal with is the internalized judgment, which is the inner critic, where we have taken all these messages that we've heard as we've grown up, right? About whatever it is, your self-care, your education, how you show up. And most of them really tried to be there to discipline us and to show us the right way. But they were really harsh and at times uncaring and at times even abusive, I would say, for some of us. And then what happens is that, of course, as we grow up, these authority figures get internalized and they become our own voices. Next time we can talk about like how to shift our inner dialogue, because I think it's really, so they become part and parcel of our inner dialogue that we take so much for granted. And instead of you, because we all have this part of us that should be authoritative, that guides you on how to do things, we then have this harsh inner critic. And the way you identify the inner critic is that when you are in the process of learning, like the example that you have, instead of learning and saying, okay, next time when they ask you like this, what should you do? It attacks your character and not your behavior, right? So there's an attack on the character and not the behavior. And then it does not teach you towards moving you to a better version of yourself. It actually breaks you. The minute you feel shame, and it operates from a space of shame, right? Brene Brown has done a lot of work around there. Again, I mean, you can read that. So it's not like I did something wrong. I am wrong. There's something wrong with me. So it really speaks from the space of the I am, your identity attacking you as a person. And then when I began to do the work of the inner critic and how I've internalized, as much as, my mother is there, she's tried the best, but I've internalized some of the voices. I told people that it was almost as if I took out this heavy jacket, which has been a burden that I've been carrying all my life up to my 30s. I was like, is it really possible to travel this light? Because most of us are not traveling light. We are traveling with all these burdens. And the inner critic is at the core of this. So I'm really glad that you've talked about this and the concept of the inner critic. So the first work is to deal internally, identify your own relationship with yourself, how you communicate to yourself about yourself, how you correct yourself when you've done something wrong, identify whose voice is that you've now internalized and it's yours, and then begin to, just as much as you learn a new language, right? And learn to speak a different language with yourself, about yourself and about your engagements. The other thing, as we share about things that seem crazy, one of the things that I do in the mornings every day when I wake up, because I know I need to shift my I ams. I come from the society that didn't confirm that. So I do work to remind myself, no, I am enough. I matter. I am significant. And I have a conversation with myself like, oh, look where you come from. I'm so proud of you. And I give myself a hug. I give myself a squeeze out. And I have a loving, caring conversation with myself. That, Lenina, just shifts my positioning in how I'm going to face the world, right? And how I'm going to deal with things. So shifting that, just that internal relationships. And then, of course, once you have won that internal victory, it is much easier to deal with the external environment. And what I usually tell people, I say, look, you have to begin to shift your expectations of your external environment. Begin to understand that the people around you, as much as they might love you, as much as they might say they care for you, they have grown up in this wounded context. This is all they know. So when you become to be enlightened and do work, don't expect them to clap hands and say, hey, Lenina, well done. We see you, girl. You are finding your light. You are waking up. You are becoming yourself. You go, girl. No, don't expect. They'll be like, Nangoku uqalile, this one, just because she's got degrees, uyambona mos. But when that happens, again, you treat them with that empathy and understand. I know where they come from. They have inherited it. And the other thing I tell people, you know what? If you can learn the skill of not being offended and not personalizing things and understand that it is not about you, it is about them, you have won. And the final one is that you may not choose what happens to you, but you can choose how you respond, and you can choose what you focus on. So when there is that backlash and people don't love you, you've got a choice. The thing that you focus on grows. So if your focus of attention is going to be them, trying to please them, trying to be pulled into this drama again, it's going to psych you back into that prison. So just learn to say, I see them. Yes, it's difficult. I can see what they are doing, but they won't be the focus of my attention. I bring the focus to myself and the work that I am doing to myself, with myself, and where I would like to go with myself.
Nomfundo, that is wonderful. I feel like I want to say so much more to contribute it, but we
Yeah.
need to take a quick break, and then we'll just
Okay.
come back, and I'd like to speak about women specifically in leadership and that imposter syndrome. So let's do that break quickly.
We are speaking about women in leadership and imposter syndrome, but we need to take a short break and we'll be back after this. Welcome back. You're still watching The Womxn Show, and tonight we're speaking about women at work, women in leadership positions, and the dreaded imposter syndrome.
So, Nomfundo, before the break, we were speaking about sort of the wounded context and looking at what imposter syndrome feels like, how to manage sort of the backlash from people when you start to shift your own feelings of from unworthiness to worthiness. Um, and just to look at again, bring the focus back to female leadership. And one of the things I'm often hearing about, and I myself at some point I was like, why is it difficult for me to connect with being a leader? Why, this notion of leadership is so foreign to me. I had like, who am I to be a leader? I'm just like this girl from Mitchell's Plain. um, and so one of the reasons that I think I came to is I started looking at like, okay, who else is out there that are leaders, and we are the first people we think of are people on TV. We think about Oprah, we think about Michelle Obama, we're thinking about until we go further. And let's be honest, there are too few female leaders, there are too few Black female leaders, and where they are quite a lot, because if you look, they're not in front of us. I just want to ask, do you think this lack of sort of information and lack of examples and the suppression really of female history has contributed to us feeling as if we are not capable of being leaders?
Yeah, yeah. No, Lynn, I think you're talking about something really powerful, just the power of being able to see yourself, to see your face in the image of success. Because our environment is constantly sending us messages and mirroring ourselves back to us. So whatever your environment says about you, there is this just conscious unconscious messages that say you can do this. So if you wake up, you are surrounded by women leaders, they are successful, they are doing the work, you open the radio, it's them, you open the TV, it's them. Everything around you says that you can do this. But as you say, we don't have that. We don't see ourselves in the face of success. So when we have to be leaders, we don't have sufficient, you can say that, water in the world to draw from,
Yeah.
so that we can be able to do that. So it really requires, that's why for me, I have told donors, as I go and get funding, and I've really been fortunate enough to, over the years, have donors that we have a good relationship with. And I say to them, look, it will be irresponsible for me to expect anyone, especially women, to come and lead in this society without giving them a life coach, because we are drawing from empty wells. There is very limited thing that we can pull from to be able to do that. So I think it's really important, and I'm grateful that there is TV shows like this. May you have more and more and more exposure, because we have, and our kids have to start seeing this, seeing more successful women. And the other thing that happens is that, of course, there's not enough of us. And those of us that do get into this position, because the society makes it so difficult for us to do the work, we get wounded in the journey of doing this, and people talk about the pull down syndrome and all of that. And I'm like, no, but guys, you have to appreciate. And it's been really difficult even for me to say, Nomfundo, how do you move up from, being a manager to a director in this society without letting it wound you, without letting it harden you, without letting it say to you that being a successful woman leader, you must look like a man who most of them may not even care, may be harsh. How do I bring my authentic self fully in being the leader that I am, even though it's different from other people? So that can actually make it difficult for us to be leaders. So that is going to really be an important work to say, as we become women leaders, let's just put ourselves on check, because studies are showing, and you know this, Lenina, that women leadership, because of us being in touch with who we are, our feminine side, actually has helped a lot of countries, a lot of institutions to be successful. But our society tries to suppress this very thing. It is not easy to show up and say, I am woman fully and I'm woman completely, and I will lead from my authentic self. I don't have to assimilate in your culture, to look like you, to sound like you, and to be like you, in order for you to see me as a woman, and in order for me to feel that I am, capable or adequate in being able to lead.
We have to acknowledge that in South Africa, and I think it's actually across the world, women are constantly going to workplaces where they are deemed inadequate, where they might even, I mean, just yesterday I was speaking to somebody who is the head of a project but was being treated like the project assistant. And she was devastated by this occurrence. And so one of the things that I have done to try and deal with the wounds that I sustained in workplaces before was to initially thinking there was something wrong with me, moving to thinking there was something wrong with the structure. I just couldn't see it because I was so stuck in the imposter syndrome.
I usually say that in this context, my most important project as a woman leader is myself. We need to flip our understanding of what work is and what workplace is. So when I go to do coaching and I focus on Nomfundo, that is my most important work, because we have to challenge these structures, we have to challenge these oppressions, but it is the position from which we're challenging them, right? Not from the position of our own wounding. Otherwise, they will suck us up and empty us up. But it is from the position of being completely connected to saying that my worth, my my significance, who I am, is not defined by what you say to me, which is not easy. I mean, it's easier said than done, as you say in books. It's really about being able to do that work and investing in connecting with the core of who I am, right? And then come back and fight the institution from that position of not being shaken. I mean, just to share my learning, because we had this thing with our board, I really struggled. So I had grown, with the managers. We all have different things we need to fight for, right? And my biggest one was when I'm in with people who really seem like harsh, I would just pull back. And I had really struggled for the longest time with the board. But when I was needed to challenge them, they're the most powerful people. I challenged them from a wounded space. So I became like passive aggressive. And the more passive aggressive I became, the harsher they became, until, after doing coaching and working on myself, because it's not easy, I was then able to stand up and say, Che, this is not how things should be happening. And I actually, then they also gave me feedback to say, you tend to be passive aggressive. I took 1% of that, of course. The rest, it was their whatever stuff that they needed to work on. But there was just something in me that stood up. So we all have different default positions that we respond from when we are wounded. So because like I'm a 9 in the Enneagram, I've also done that work, which has really helped. I tend to become passive aggressive. If other people who are 8s, if they are wounded, they tend to just come in and become aggressive, and you come from that space of attack without really being connected to yourself. So just really be aware of what is an interaction style that comes from your wound. Go to a space where you are able to heal. And I mean, I don't support this, mental wellness that says, oh, you just need to be okay and be happy. For me, I'm like, look, yes, I need to be okay and fine, but I have to go back and fight a system that is going to oppress me. But from what position do I fight it? And I have to fight it from the position where it does not bend me, it does not wound me, and it does not compromise who I am. So yeah, I think the main thing is just to say, Lenina, our most important work is ourselves. We have to shift that. And we have to spend the time in the day or in the week, have an hour, 2 hours. It's part and parcel of your work to be working on yourself. So then you can go. So for this lady, going back and deciding what is the best way for me to challenge this system. Other people might end up saying, after some time, I really have to just leave because that doesn't work. But you don't do it because you are running away from something, but because you've worked on yourself and you are clear about what matters to you. Yeah.
I think that's really great, Nomfundo. And I think, we're running out of time, but I want to end off with something. You brought something up which is very important. And I also had to work on this, is like, as I'm doing the work, I'm like, what am I working towards?
Our greatest work is being present in the present in a loving, caring, and supportive way. And it's about when the wounded self shows up, is to see it. It seems like such a simple thing, but it is so powerful, right? It's about learning to be present completely to all that is here, that is present now, without judgment, without fixing, without shifting, to be completely present to ourselves.
I absolutely love that. Thank you, Nomfundo. We're out of time, but I want to thank you so much for the insights, and we hope to have you back soon.
Great. Take care. Bye.
That was Nomfundo Mogape, who is the Executive Director of the Center for the Study of Reconciliation and Violence and the founder of the Mental Wellness Initiative, chatting to us about imposter syndrome and the drivers of it. We are going to take a short break, but we'll be back with more after this. Welcome back. You're still watching The Womxn Show. We're almost at the end of our hour together. But before we go, I'm going to introduce a woman called Lenina Rassool, who is an attorney who has worked in the Constitutional Court, who is also the founder of an organization called Women Lead Movement that educates women, girls, and communities about their rights and their power as citizens to facilitate changes in their own lives and within the country. I bring up Lenina because she was born and raised in a backyard dwelling in Delft, and recently in an interview she said that where you live shouldn't determine whether you live. And I'm going to add on, I'm going to use live very broadly. Not just a matter of breathing in air, but also a matter of building a good, sustainable and wonderful life for ourselves. Now, a video was recently made about Lenina, her background, where she's come from. We're going to play this video, and we hope that it inspires you to understand that no matter where you come from, we can all achieve greatness, and we all have the ability to work our way up. Let's have a look at that video.
I was so young in this photo. If only I had known what was in store for me. I would have said, even though you're from a tiny community on the Cape Flats of South Africa, being an African girl doesn't disqualify you from anything. You come from humble beginnings, a blank canvas. But I'm here to tell you that you are an exceptional young girl with an imagination that touches the stars. I know that behind your contagious laughter, you're afraid. Afraid that the dreams that keep you up at night will not be realized and that you will never escape these cycles of poverty and violence that seep into your soul. I know that the only thing stitching all the pieces of you together is the belief that you will get out. You don't know it yet, but you will go far. And I'm just so proud of you. This house you grew up in, a shack in the backyard of someone else's home. This room, these walls, they have a story to tell. I know you get sad looking at the harsh conditions you see around you, especially how your sisters, aunties, and mothers battle every day to survive. But these experiences will soon be the reason you wake up in the morning. The reason you fight as hard as you do. You don't know it yet, but you will become an attorney working in the highest court of our land. I was 18 when I went to the University of the Western Cape and I did my first law degree, became a lawyer, and then I went to the Constitutional Court. And then after that, I was appointed the youngest cabinet committee secretary that was allowed to sit in the meetings of the president and the minister. You will lead seminars and teach women to be a driving force in this democracy. The fact that I've worked in government meant that I saw what kind of decisions the government took and what impact that decisions would have on people like us. That's my job, to tell you the truth about the Constitution, to tell you the truth about democracy, and how you can influence the way democracy evolves in South Africa. You will not speak for them, but you will amplify their voices when they can't, teaching them the value of the vote and how to use their power. So I know that where I am now is exactly what I'm supposed to do, and that is opening up the minds of brilliant young women like yourself. And I mean, you as the leaders, the young women leaders, Women Lead Movement. You will start the Women Lead Movement and be an internationally recognized activist that will drive the global fight for equality, and this movement will elevate the voices of women in your community and around the world. The movement is not a selfish movement. It's a woman-led movement. I'm going to expect you to go back home, use the information, and educate your mom. We are born from the work of our mothers. I know you look into your mother's eyes and you see pain, but more so, you see her fierceness.
Nelly and I made the thing. These parties were always in front of the shack. So the shack was
The place to be.
The place to be on the road. The place to be.
This one, I really love this one. Goodness, yeah, this
These are your great days.
This was
This is
amazing.
your great days.
When I got my master's,
Clive and Auntie Fona came along.
were you proud that day?
Super proud.
You're always proud.
So proud.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I mean, for me to have sort of like her, you will be fierce in fighting for their rights, for their dignity. You will fight because you believe that gender equality and justice must be achieved for both men and women alike. You will be on the front lines. Okay, so today we're going to discuss something a little, not really that different from human rights, because the issue of gender is also an issue of human rights, okay? Like the power balance is just totally skewed, and we need to rectify the balance. And I'm very happy that there's men in this room today that needs to hear all these things. Know that you will have to work harder than men to be recognized. You will have to work harder than women in other parts of the world to be seen as significant. Always remember that tough times don't last, but tough people do. You are a warrior who will emerge greater every time. I promise. You will often feel as if you don't fit in, but it was never your destiny to fit in. You were born to stand out. You will buy a house and support your family. And you will help other women do that for themselves too. You will send a message to world leaders saying that none of us are equal until all of us are equal. So keep your chin up and your heart strong, because the revolution has just begun. Yours in power, Lenina Rassool.
And that brings us to the end of our show. Thank you for joining us. I'm Lenina Rassool. Good night.